Well, I'm delighted to be here and very much appreciate the invitation, and it's great to be back in Sofia. And I'm going to aim to talk for about half an hour or so. And what I really want to do is, given that there is a quite fascinating program of discussions over the next few days, very much focused on the what and the how of various disinformation and malign influence campaigns. So I thought I would focus a little bit, to give it some context, in the why. In other words, what is it that actually Russia is trying to do? How does it see its campaign? And in particular, I want to stress the degree to which disinformation and similar operations fit into a much wider context. And I think we do have to understand it in that wider context to really be able to address it. And we have to start with a rather depressing fact, which is that Russia considers itself to be at war with us. Now, we may not want to be at war with Russia, but that's our tough luck, because it only takes one side to start it. And Putin himself has been very candid about this. I mean, at a time when for Russians themselves to still describe what's happening in Ukraine as a war means that they actually risk being sent to prison, nonetheless, Putin is perfectly happy to use that word war in terms of Russia's relations with the West. He said it himself in his 2023 Victory Day speech, for example. He said a very real war, as he put it, is being waged against Russia. So in this context, what's happening in Ukraine, however terrible, however pyrotechnic, is, from his point of view, just one front, just one theater in a wider conflict. And indeed, what's happening in Ukraine is because the West willed it to be so. Remember, that same bizarre misunderstanding, that sort of strange collection of half-understood histories that Putin put together to try and understand Ukraine, which more or less means that he doesn't actually believe Ukraine exists as a country. He believes it as just somehow some kind of strange historical sort of annex of Russia. Well, that same misunderstanding means that he denies the Ukrainians' agency. He assumes that what the Ukrainians do is because the West, and that essentially means the Americans, though the British do still crop up a lot as the sort of the lesser Satan, so it's nice to know someone thinks we still matter. But nonetheless, that essentially what the Ukrainians do is because that's what they're told to do. So we're at war, like it or not. But what does that mean? I mean, does that mean we seriously have to feel that at some point Russian tanks will be rolling over our borders? I personally think that's monstrously unlikely, even though I appreciate that there are those who say that if Ukraine falls, NATO will be next and so forth. But that's because one has to understand quite what the Russians mean when they talk about war. And particularly what they mean when they talk about we call it hybrid war. I must admit, I don't like that formulation, but we're stuck with it. But then there's the relationship between hybrid war and real war. Because I think what's not often understood is the degree to which the Russians have, in effect, two different parallel concepts. If you look at how the Russian military thinks about hybrid operations, it thinks about them in ways that in the West we might just call shaping operations. In other words, they're there to prepare the battlefield. As we saw, for example, in Crimea in 2014, the degree to which you use disinformation and subversion and a variety of other covert means to prepare the ground so that when you actually send your troops in, hopefully they've already won. That's the military's perspective. However, the military do not run Russia. If one looks at the national security establishment, which is very much, I would say, the dominant force, the ones that are closest to Putin, Remember, Putin is a man with no meaningful military experience or whatever. He actually gravitates more to the spies and their various kind of think tank allies than the generals. They have a rather different notion, a notion that is actually much, much closer to what the veteran American scholar diplomat George Kennan called political war. In other words, the use of all means at a nation's disposal short of war, legal and illegal, overt and covert, from economic pressure to organized criminality, in order to try and bring your national agenda to bear. Major General Vladimirov, who was obviously you can tell, a Russian military officer who then moved across into the presidential administration, that is really, I would say, the most important institution within Putin's Russia. He himself said, modern wars are waged on the level of consciousness and ideas. And this is very much something that they had taken to heart. This idea that you can actually fight a war without a single shot being fired through the use of these alternative instruments. Because what is war but simply a way of forcing another country to do what you want it to do? And in the modern world, often that doesn't really mean anything to do with ceding territory or whatever. It may well actually be precisely to adopt certain political routes. So, what is it actually that the Russians are trying to do? Well, in my opinion, their goal for the West is essentially disruption. Disruption as a goal in its own right. Because, if nothing else, they do have a sense of the limits of their own capacities. That they're dealing with an alliance which, when unified, is vastly stronger than the Russians on every single index of power. Military power, economic power, soft power, you name it. But that's the point, when unified. We are also a constellation of democracies, with all the consequent divisions within our countries and between our countries. And for someone like Putin, that is our weakness, that is our vulnerability, that so many of these efforts are intended to magnify those divisions. And therefore, we have this campaign of disinformation plus, let's say. Disinformation augmented by a whole variety of other means. Because, first of all, it's something that we find very difficult to reply to. We aren't, I'm glad to say, in the business of fighting disinformation with disinformation. We're not about to try and spread lies as a response. We're not about to start launching cruise missiles because someone sends a nasty tweet our way. I mean, even attribution is often a problem. So for all kinds of reasons, this is actually a challenge that we find it very difficult to respond to in active ways. And secondly, it is essentially precisely speaking to, as Putin would regard it, our weaknesses. Our belief in freedom of expression, in a plurality of media. All of these things, which are absolutely central, as we've heard, to our notion of what being a Western democracy means, creates inevitable vulnerabilities. So this is the card we've been played. And so what's Putin trying to do? He wants to divide us. He wants to demoralize us. He wants us precisely to feel that this Russian campaign is so insidious and pervasive and impossible to deal with that actually we just give up and say, well, we need to find some way of essentially buying the Russians off. This is the geopolitics of the protection racketeer. Lovely democracy you've got here. Pity if it fell into chaos. Or are you willing to pay me to leave you alone? And obviously, at the same time, he wants to disrupt the capacity of Western states to be able to operate. And this, for me, for example, was one of the key lessons we have from the Russian campaigns around the American elections that we've just seen. Yes, of course, there was no question but that Putin wanted Trump elected, despite the fact that he said that he supported Kamala because of her infectious laugh. Because that's, we all know that's the basis on which Putin makes his political calculations. But at the same time, if one actually looks at the messaging and the targeting of Russian disinformation, which, it has to be stressed, I very much doubt was in any way critical in this massive swing towards Trump. I'm sure it played some role, but it was not in any way determining. But actually, a lot of the Russian messaging was not actually about why people should vote for Trump. It was precisely trying to stoke up divisions within the United States. Because as a essentially post-ideological nation, Putin's Russia can support left and right, nationalists and secessionists, Black Lives Matter and the National Rifle Association. They don't care as long as they can stir up potential trouble. Because I think the idea was, they were anticipating, like most pundits, that this would be a very tight election, and they thought, well, that's a perfect opportunity to basically set Americans against other Americans. Often that is their goal, is chaos, because that is disruptive. So what do they use? Well, obviously they use disinformation, but I imagine everyone here knows about that, so I'm not going to talk about that much directly. They obviously also use strategic corruption and attempts to influence leaderships. They've learnt, I think, that they can't, on the whole, swing elections, but on the other hand, they can see whom they can flatter, whom they can corrupt, whether we're talking financially or through other means. Where can they get additional voices? Not least because this also helps push their agenda of political division. Beyond that, though, what we're seeing increasingly in Europe in particular is actually direct sabotage and similar campaigns. We've seen, if one thinks just this year, everything from the assassination of a Russian defector in Spain to arson attacks on warehouses owned by Ukrainians in London, to arson attacks indeed on shopping centres in Poland and the Baltic states, cyber attacks on Czech railways. A very wide range of what actually might often seem quite trivial individually attacks. But it is clear that it's part of a growing campaign of physical and cyber attacks intended to bring about, what I've taken to calling the weaponization of inconvenience. In other words, to begin to add sufficient troubles into our daily lives so that today your train isn't running because of a cyber attack, and tomorrow the internet's running slow when you want to download and stream a film, and the shopping mall that you plan to go to has been closed because of a spurious bomb scare. Or maybe there's a real bomb, who knows? And maybe even more dramatic things. We've heard cases, for example, about DHL cargo planes, which could have potentially been brought down by incendiary devices. The idea is essentially to make Europeans feel that their lives are worsened by their support for Ukraine. Because remember, the main potential point of weakness for Ukraine is in the West. If Western aid, Western support for Ukraine, military, financial, as well as political, begins to weaken, then Kiev's in a very tough spot. So a lot of this is actually sort of with an eye to making us think twice about our support for Ukraine. But the thing is exactly, it's an accretion of lots of small-scale inconveniences in our lives, none of which individually would reach NATO Article 5 or Article 4 standards, none of which can we really respond to in any meaningful way, but all bit by bit intended to begin to make our publics think, do we really care enough about Ukraine to be worth putting up with this? So three approaches, and the key point is they all operate in symphony. You know, they are in a situation in which they're wielded strategically so that the whole is greater than the sum of their parts. For example, think of the cooperation possible between when you have leaders who are willing to essentially repeat your own talking points and also disinformation mills happy to amplify it. The example I would give is former Czech President Zeman, who, for his own reasons, would often come out with outrageous claims which very much fit the Russian agenda. And then what the Russians would do is not just amplify that within the Czech Republic, but they would take that elsewhere across Central and Southern Europe and be able to say, look, the president of a NATO country is saying this. And suddenly, what otherwise would have just been random disinformation seems to have a greater authority, a greater weight to it. Or indeed, the synergy between direct attacks and disinformation. I mean, much of the direct attacks are really intended to support the disinformation line that essentially says democracy isn't working. The West isn't working. And you're more likely to believe that if you've just spent 3 hours trying to get to work. Likewise, we have situations in which, take for example, there was a series of anti-Semitic graffiti placed on Jewish memorials in France generally, particularly Paris. By all accounts carried out in some cases by anti-Semites, but in other cases just by local thugs who earn themselves €50 to go and daub some graffiti somewhere. But the point is then the Russian disinformation mills can take that something that has happened in the real world, and use that to say, look, we told you that there was Nazi and anti-Semitic and neo-fascist sentiments within the West. Here's the proof. And with different messaging, they can approach the Jewish community and say, you see, you're not really being protected. And indeed, the ultra-right community, and say, why aren't you doing your bit? Other honest people are standing up and saying what they think about the Jews. So in any case, basically having something happen in the real world magnifies the opportunities in the disinformation world. So I think this is the key point, that we have to appreciate that disinformation is part of a wider Kremlin strategy, and as we've heard from the minister, likely to be picked up in due course by other disruptive actors around the world. I mean, I think already we're beginning to see, for example, Iran learning some of the Russian lessons. But anyway, it's all part of a wider strategy. Well, it's all very well. We can all admire the problem. We can all say, oh, isn't it terrible? All these nasty Russians, all this problematic disinformation. Obviously, the key question, and I think it is very central to this event, is, so what do we do about it? Not a dramatic pause there, just simply I needed to have some water. By acquiring some sense of the goal, that also gives us a better sense of responses. And as I said, this is not a struggle that really we can fight on even terms, because we shouldn't resort to the same kind of methods. And indeed, the interesting thing is the degree to which actually we are still very slowly, I would say, relearning lessons learned during the Cold War. Or maybe in hindsight we'll call it the first Cold War. I'm often struck, for example, about what happened with Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, that began essentially as CIA operations, and a lot of what they were transmitting was just frankly propaganda. And it wasn't really working. Until they realized, and I would say to a large extent seeing what had happened with the BBC World Service, that in fact the most effective weapon against an information management regime that lies routinely is the truth. And in that context, it's worth noting, after all, that there is clearly a hunger, even within Russia, for the truth. BBC World Service foreign language stations, most of them, they've seen their audiences continue to decline over the years. The most recent assessments of audiences, though, has shown a distinct expansion in the audience of its Russian language services. Even though people actually have to use VPNs to bypass government controls on the internet, nonetheless, they are listening because they want to hear the truth. So there are things I would suggest that we can do to actually fight back more actively. But that's not going to be how we solve this problem. I mean, this helps, maybe. We have to acknowledge that essentially, because as far as Putin is concerned, this is a wider struggle with the West, whom he, wrongly, but nonetheless whom he believes is the aggressor, trying to deny Russia its real place as a great power with a sphere of influence and such like. Even if Donald Trump does manage to solve the Ukraine conflict in 24 hours or 3 days or whatever he promised, which I will confess I do have a certain skepticism about. But even if the Ukraine war ends next year, and we can hope, obviously, that it ends in the right terms, that will not end our Russia problem, because our Russia problem is a Putin problem. So certainly as long as, maybe afterwards as well, but certainly so long as Putin is in the Kremlin, we will continue to, in effect, face a Russia that is hostile to us, that fears us, believes that we are actually out to get it, and that therefore will push back in its own terms. So this is the new normal. This is not just something, well, if you can just hold on for a few more months or maybe a year or two, everything will get better. And if we're going to try and stop it, really this means deterrence. And the problem is, in classic deterrence theory, there's two sorts of deterrence. There's deterrence by punishment. You do something that we don't like and we'll do something worse to you. There's really not much we can do about this. We have sanctioned pretty much everyone we can sanction. It's not as though we really have sort of particularly useful instruments at our disposal. So instead, we're having to look at the other thing, deterrence by denial, which is essentially the way of saying, look, it's not even worth your trying to attack us, because you'll fail. And that, I think, is really how we need to be thinking about our responses to this campaign. It's how to essentially try and ensure, although sometimes certain attack lines, certain disinformation campaigns are going to land, nonetheless, in general terms, they are sufficiently ineffective that the Kremlin no longer regards it as worth spending resources in doing this. And look, on one level, we all know the standard responses. It's about resilience, it's about media literacy, and all that kind of thing. However, first of all, I would add that once we understand that disinformation is just one part, it also emphasizes why there are other things that also need to be addressed at the same time. You know, the Russians are increasingly using, for example, organized crime as proxies for some of their operations. We need to be addressing that. We need to be putting more effort into counterintelligence, because a lot of the disinformation is targeted thanks to or broadcast through the use of Russia's intelligence agencies. So we need to also be thinking of this as actually a counterintelligence operation as well as something to do with just sort of media and information. But, and this is the final point I'd make, a lot of what we hear proposed is essentially top-down. It's about governments and states helping the people understand more what's happening and that kind of thing. And there is absolutely a real role for that. It's absolutely crucial. But ultimately, disinformation works because we let it work. We click on that dubious story that nonetheless agrees with our prejudices or just sounds fun. we elect what could be politely described as post-truth politicians because they're saying the right thing or because they just seem like quite fun guys or anything like that. Of course, Britain has been totally immune to that particular malaise. We continue to believe that we are able to identify truth from fiction, when in fact often what we are doing is following what is comfortable and convenient to us rather than anything else. So when it comes down to it, we also have to understand an absolutely crucial point, that this is not something that governments can fix. Because frankly, one of the key reasons why disinformation works is because democracy is going through, I wouldn't necessarily call it a crisis, but nonetheless, a period of pressure. And politicians too often are not honest with us, and we don't punish them for it. When it comes down to it, we need to vote for people who'll tell us the hard truths. We need to actually not follow the engaging conspiracy theories that are much more fun than the tedious realities. We can, in short, have all the integrity and honesty and resilience within our societies that we, as individual citizens, are willing to demand. And until we do that, then there's no end of projects and things that can be sort of mandated from above or indeed generated by civil society. But they ultimately will be going against the grain of what society as a whole is actually in effect asking for. This is a creature of our own creation. On that uplifting note, I think it's worth trying to stop and then open it up to questions or furious rebuttals.
Thank you. Can someone help me with a microphone in the hall? Or, thanks. Now I'll stand up to see your hands. Any questions? Velizar Shalamanov, I think I see.
Thank you very much. Really inspiring speech on the problem that we face. My question is, what is preventing us, free world, to recognize that the most important challenge, the real threat to our world is Russia? Because we are trying to address many challenges, from climate change to Middle East, to China. If we are not able to recognize what is the real and present danger for us, it will be very difficult to resolve it. So how do you see the solution of this issue, to recognize, to understand, and really to mobilize ourselves for this whole of society approach that you presented? Thank you.
I think ultimately, I would challenge the notion that Russia as such is the greatest threat to us. If we're talking about, I'm fortunately old enough that I probably won't see it, but for those of you who are younger, climate change is absolutely going to shape your world in a way that no nation state can. If you are, an impoverished individual working a really hard job, scarcely able to make enough money to survive economically, then actually Russia is not probably something that you're going to regard as your greatest threat. I think that what we need to understand is not so much, in my opinion, that Russia is the threat as such. It's that Russia happens to be the challenger that has found our weak point quickest and most effectively. In many ways, I'm a lot more worried if, for example, relations with China deteriorate dramatically, and we find the same instruments being used by China, but with a lot more resource and quite possibly a lot more effectiveness. So look, Russia absolutely as a state is a challenger, but on the other hand, Russia is also, I would say, a declining power. And Russia's capacity to cause direct trouble for us is, to a degree, limited. So I'm not trying to underplay it, but I just think that if we make Russia the big challenge or whatever, I think that we misunderstand the nature. I think that to broaden this out dramatically, I touched on the challenge to democracy. I mean, the modern notions of democracy are essentially still rooted in 19th century models of society. Of class, and frankly, it's clearly having trouble coping with the challenges of the modern world. It's not because of foreign manipulation or whatever that democracy from Anchorage to Ankara is under challenge. There's a whole variety of factors. So I think in some ways, actually, if we could create, and we go back to that awful word, resilience. I mean, resilience is really important. It's used so often in so many contexts that it begins to lose meaning. But actually, working societies are, if we could address that, then actually it allows us to address a whole variety of immediate challenges. But as regards Russia, I mean, I would just make one other point, which is that for so many people, Russia is a long way away. When I'm talking to people in the UK, in some ways we do have a sense of Russia as a challenge, particularly because there's been high-profile assassinations, Litvinenko with radioactive polonium, attempt to kill Sergei Skripal, another defector, with Novichok nerve agent, which has helped kind of dramatize the Russian threat. But I mean, I was talking to a group of politicians in Rome earlier this year, and frankly, they were saying, look, Ukraine's a long way away. Russia is a long way away. The real security threat we face is coming from North Africa, and it's coming from the Middle East. And on one level, they were right. On another level, in an interconnected world, distance doesn't matter. And of course, Russia is a threat to Italy, just as elsewhere. But I think it is this problem of trying to understand that the threat Russia poses does not necessarily mean tanks across the border. And unfortunately, although I understand why a lot of our politicians are emphasizing that at the moment, because it's a way of dramatizing the threat, make people think it's real, at a time when there is a certain amount of Ukraine fatigue. The risk of that is that people who don't believe that Russian tanks are going to roll across their border, therefore think Russia doesn't matter. Russia does. But Russia exploits our weaknesses, and we let it.
One thing to ask, probably to push back on the idea that sanctions start hurting them, I think that's a bit misplaced, because if we see into LNG sanctions, Novatek has completely stopped doing LNG projects, and now they're considering doing fertilizers instead of LNG. I think we have a lot more to do with sanctions if we target and enforce them than we think we're currently able to.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue for a moment that sanctions weren't working. I mean, I think one of the problems with sanctions is that people overplayed at the beginning the likely impact when there were people talking about how the Russian economy was going to be crashed within weeks and so forth, and that clearly wasn't going to happen. But no, absolutely, sanctions are working, and we need to continue the effort to identify the loopholes and make the existing sanctions work. My point was that additionally, we don't really have much, in my opinion, scope for meaningful additional sanctions, especially not ones that actually have any kind of resonance with disinformation issues. Sure, we could ban a few more media executives and so forth. That's not going to stop them. So yes, sanctions work as a long-term way of degrading the Russian war machine and the economy behind it, but they're not an answer, in my opinion, to the disinformation piece.
I have two names on my list, Dimitar Vatsov and then Nikola Tulechki.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your brilliant lecture. I agree with you generally with that it is difficult for us to understand that we are already in a war. because despite of being happy or not with this fact, Russia is treating us as an enemy directly. And we should respond to some extent, even in with some communication strategies, with some counter-propaganda, because we are a target of this propaganda. And Russia is the elephant in the room at the moment. Of course, there are a lot of other threats, there are a lot of other propaganda efforts to ruin our democracies, but this is the main threat. I would like to ask you, do you think that there is something interesting or specific for the Russian propaganda efforts at the moment? On the one hand, Russian Federation, to my mind, resurrected the old agitprop from the Soviet era, agitation and propaganda governed by the states. We has been forgotten such practices for many decades, I think, but Russia re-established the state as a main governor of all the media and propaganda efforts. But at the same time, as you mentioned many times, as you stressed many times, these efforts are not ideologically coherent. They use different facts, different weaknesses of our societies, interpret one and the same factual reality in different ways, depending on their contextual interests and depending on the target groups they are speaking to. Could we describe the specifics of the Russian propaganda and disinformation efforts that way? Thank you.
Okay, 2 points. First of all, on the business of war fighting, shall we say. I mean, look, I think there is much more that we could be doing. I mean, I don't think we should be getting into the business of attempted regime change in Russia, both because it would validate Putin's own narrative, and also because we've proven to be catastrophically bad at managing regime change. We're good at doing it. We're not so good at actually making sure that there's a positive outcome from it. But regime change is not the same as regime damaging. And I do think that we could be thinking a lot more imaginatively about ways of using information in particular to support the efforts that are already being done through sanctions and other ways to actually essentially punish this regime for its aggressive acts. You know, and I think that would mean, for example, reaching out much more to Russians. And there's all sorts of interesting and imaginative ways of doing so. I mean, for example, video games. You know, actually, a lot of Russians play Western computer games. And as a result, they use their VPNs and they go onto Discord sites and so forth, and they form kind of gaming clans that are transnational. Well, this gives us points of traction with Russians that we could be exploiting. So, I mean, there's a whole realm of areas we could be doing to actually, in some ways, widen our campaign against Putin's regime. But to go on to this main point about the ideology and the post-ideological kind of disinformation campaign, I mean, I think, look, to a large extent, it's opportunity-driven. When something crops up, they will jump on it and magnify it. And again, this is the virtue of states, that they can actually, when they identify something, they can throw resources at it. We had a terrible case in the UK this summer of someone who ran amok with a knife and killed some schoolgirls. And very quickly, unfortunately, someone claimed that it had been a migrant who had done this. Now, that unfortunately was someone from the UK who came up with that dangerous narrative. But what happened is the Russians massively amplified it, and it helped encourage, it's hard to know precisely how far it was responsible, but nonetheless, there were a series of race riots and so forth. So again, often actually, in a way, the Russians are looking for the opportunity, that vulnerable point that they can then magnify. But also, go on to your point about the degree to which, in a way, the old Soviet-style, agitprop apparatus has been revived. I mean, you're right, and if one looks at, for example, the state media, it's clear that it's, or the media, the Russian media has now all been, essentially it's either directly state-controlled or indirectly state-controlled. That's the only difference. And there are narratives that they're told to put out and such like. However, an interesting aspect of Putin's Russia is that it is still quite, I suppose, committed to the public-private partnership, in that actually you do have a lot of essentially independent actors within the disinformation space. Once upon a time it was Prigozhin's troll farms. Now, actually, interestingly, since Prigozhin's death, a lot of other individuals and agencies have essentially taken over bits of Prigozhin's media empire. But generally, there are still, whether it's in terms of corporations or individuals or intelligence services or whatever, there's still a lot of autonomous bodies. And again, what happens is that Putin is happy to allow these autonomous bodies to all try their own different information lines, because then if one doesn't land, if one fails, no government resource has been put behind it. But if one succeeds, then the government massively supports that sort of venture. So this is our problem. I mean, I think we are in a way, fighting a race also, not just an arms race, but an imaginations race with the Russians. And the Russians, unlike the Soviets, are proving terribly imaginative in how they approach this. In terms of, sometimes it's the silly stuff. It's that, you can have some vicious, racist, or disruptive narrative, but you add a cute picture of a cat, and people are more likely to read it and disseminate it or whatever. One thinks of the ponderous old Soviet propaganda, which, as someone who professionally had to read a lot of it, was often incredibly tedious and clumsy. A lot of the Russian stuff is witty and imaginative, and this is what makes it dangerous. And it's not because government bureaucrats necessarily have become witty and imaginative. It's because, in some ways, they've more or less reached out to Russian society and said, look, if you want to join this campaign and enrich yourself and feel that you're doing something for the motherland, come and join us. And the nature of the modern information space is such that they can.
We have another question at the back of the room. Nicola.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the mesmerizing lecture. My question has to do with the "we shouldn't do like them" theme, which came up in your talk, and I'm hearing it all over the place when we're talking about disinformation and information operation. But on the other hand, some of the stuff that they do and some of the stuff that they have learned to do is quite advanced. From you, I learned that the GUSP director has a doctoral dissertation on mathematical models of information spaces from 2006. So it's basically some of the stuff that we'll be talking about here, some of the research, they have been doing it since the last 20 years. So my question is, what is the West not doing that the Russians are doing and they're doing well and will be permissible or okay to do here?
Well, I'm not going to try and talk about actually the sort of the technical details of how the Russians are doing it, because that's not my area. And there's people at this conference who are infinitely better placed to be able to answer that. I mean, I think broadly speaking, what I think the Russians have appreciated, or learned to understand, rather, is precisely that we now live in an age where there are no more gatekeepers, no more people who get to control what information gets out. Yes, there are still newspaper editors and TV sort of executives, but the point is they are often following rather than leading the information thing. It's, the line that became a Twitter storm overnight is probably going to be being picked up in the morning by the radio and TV stations and the newspapers and such like. We've moved from an era of gatekeepers to amplifiers. There are just some people now who can retweet or restate or just generally highlight information and it spreads out. And I think, in a way, that's really what the Russians have learned to have really understood. It is precisely just the changing nature of the information space. And the Russians have understood this not because they're smarter than us or anything like that, but in some ways precisely they went through that same kind of massive transition from a highly controlled information environment in Soviet times, which exploded. And then in the 1990s, I mean, the Russian information space was a truly bizarre place where every single weird conspiracy theory was being taken at face value. I mean, I remember, you'll be hearing tales about huge mutant rats in the sewers being chased down by Afghan war veterans, and that this icon had miraculously healed someone and so forth. And that was probably just while you were walking to the library in the morning. I think precisely, actually, in some ways the Russians have learned that lesson the hard way themselves because of the dramatic collapse. And in our case, the collapse of the information control order has been a bit more gentle and a bit less obvious, and therefore we haven't been as quick to pick up on it. I don't know if that helps as an answer at all.
I think I saw sign back there, yes. And yeah, it's you. And this will be our last question.
Hi. So first of all, thank you for a very inspiring keynote with a lot of interesting thoughts. I want to relate to the first question which was asked, where you, as a part of the answer, mentioned that today's Western democracies are democracies of 19th century style. So I want to ask, what's your vision of democracy for 21st century, or more specifically, if you can, if you have any examples of successful policies which are bringing the Western democracies closer to where they could be better off in this sad situation. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, do I have a vision for 21st century democracy? Gosh, I wish I did. So thank you so much for asking me a question, the last question, to put me on the spot and force me to admit my ignorance. No, I mean, I think generally speaking, again, the old model of democracy is one which is based around class solidarities. That essentially you have political blocks that are built around issues which tend to be rooted in economic interest. That's clearly falling apart now. Instead, what we have is just simply a much more fluid environment. Now, I'm not a great fan of the referendum. It certainly hasn't suited Britain particularly well in recent times. But nonetheless, I think that actually that issue speaks to the degree to which we probably will see more direct democracy in the future, as individual issues are actually sort of discussed and polled upon. And also because it's just a lot easier with modern technology. And also, and again, I slightly hesitate to say this in Bulgaria, but coalition politics. But we have to find ways of making coalition politics work. And the problem is that, after all, until pretty recently, Germany was often raised as an example of successful coalition politics. This week, I don't know if one could necessarily make that claim. But the interesting thing is that, if you look at a lot of the Scandinavian countries, and okay, we often raise Scandinavian countries as exemplars, but that's in part because they have it quite easy. But nonetheless, actually sort of in terms of ways in which they've managed to find, opportunities to bridge, that you can have a coalition of quite different parties that necessarily finds ways of working. But again, in part, that goes back to my point about what do we as a public want or expect? Because that works there, because there is a public sense of how you expect your governing parties to comport themselves, to manage themselves. Too often in the West, we have very low expectations of our politicians, and they still manage to disappoint us. But nonetheless, we have low expectations. And that, I think, is the fundamental problem. I mean, actually, one of the issues that we're going to have to address is that, in fact, we should have the best and the brightest ruling us. but also be able and willing to hold them seriously to account. As is, we too often accept that our politicians are going to be spineless and or corrupt. And therefore we are unfazed when they prove to be spineless and or corrupt. Now, again, I wish I had an answer. I'm unfortunately too much a creature of the 20th century. But nonetheless, I think we can acknowledge that some of the tensions and the pressures. And this is why, you know, there is at the moment this tale about how authoritarianisms are on the rise again. The only reason authoritarians are on the rise is, again, because of our own failings. It's not actually that many people genuinely think, wow, you know, I wish my country was more like Turkey or Russia. It's often that they feel that they have no alternative, real. It's up for democracy to reinvent itself and present itself as an attractive alternative.